The Lakers just had their annual intro press conference, and honestly, it showed us a lot about where this team stands. JJ Redick somehow already got a new contract, extended for 2 more years on top of the one he originally signed, which feels like favoritism more than strategy. They went over the roles of the new faces on the roster too, bringing up Marcus Smart, DeAndre Jordan, even Jalen Hood-Schifino. I already made a whole video on that if you care to watch. But what stood out more was how they talked about future moves. Rob Pelinka kept hammering the word optionality, probably throwing it out 10 to 15 times in the same interview. And no, that's not an exaggeration. They really tried to sell the idea that this so-called optionality is about trades, shaking up the team, and setting a timeline for when changes could come. And yes, they actually laid out a clear timeline for it. So now we need to break down what they mean by optionality and why they're leaning so hard on it. What that really means is figuring out how long it might take them to actually look at trades, if they ever bother at all, and what would push them to finally make that move. So let's get into it and break it all down. Rob Pelinka made it clear again in this interview, repeating that word optionality, when talking about trade flexibility and roster flexibility, both now and later, specifically saying the 20 to 25 game mark is their timeline. And there's a pretty obvious reason for that. Actually, there are several. First off, it gives them plenty of time to judge what this roster really is. That includes the starting 5, the rotation, the new players they added, basically everything. They'll use that time to see if the group is working, if there's any real momentum, or if it's already falling apart. Maybe they only need a small tweak, maybe just a role player, or maybe a cheap signing. Or maybe the whole thing is a disaster and needs to be blown up completely.
How do you, and you've mentioned the flexibility, that being a priority, how do you anticipate that playing out? I guess what are the hopes of that dynamic going into training camp, going into the season, and how that plays out with so much flexibility and, guys,
I think the key is, I like the word optionality better, I think, than flexibility. I think we've all seen the impact that this new NBA CBA system, or relatively new system, has had on teams. And one of the things that's really hard is if you get trapped above the aprons, over the aprons, deep into them, you lose your optionality. And we, again, have been very disciplined and intentional on how we put the roster and cap together to lean into that optionality. Now, that said, I don't see optionality as a word that applies to the distant long-term future. That optionality could be now. It could be if there is a move to be made, we have the optionality to look at it, study it, and decide if it helps our team. That said, JJ and I have a high level of confidence in this group. And I think early in the season, we're going to get a sense of where some of the needs might arise. I think as a general rule, we've talked before, you like 20, 25 games to kind of see what the makeup of your team looks like and see where it's at, and then you start evaluating those roster moves. But we feel good about the optionality. At the same time, we really like a lot of the players that are on short-term contracts, and you could use that optionality to keep those players as well. So we'll continue to evaluate.
That stretch of games is their test run to figure out who they really are. So here's what Rob Pelinka actually said about it. He was asked basically, "You've been hyping this flexibility as the big priority. So how do you really see that playing out now? What exactly are the expectations for that approach heading into training camp, into the season? And how do you think it works when you're selling this much so-called flexibility to the players and the fans?" Interview. Like I said, the word optionality was basically the theme of that whole segment. Honestly, if you took a shot every time Rob Pelinka said it, you'd probably pass out before you made it through the interview. And good luck getting anything done the rest of the week. But that's exactly the point. He kept hammering it over and over. And like I mentioned earlier, it clearly carries more than one meaning. It's not just about flexibility, even though that's obviously part of it, both from roster flexibility, trade flexibility, asset flexibility. That's really the core of what Pelinka is pushing with this optionality buzzword. Basically, it means giving themselves time to judge their assets and decide if they should flip some of them to upgrade the team. If they don't, they can stash those assets until later, maybe next summer, and wait for a bigger move. That's really the main angle. We already know Rob Pelinka clings to draft picks, and honestly, that's the trend across the NBA right now, with everyone becoming way too obsessed with protecting them under the new CBA rules. He clearly doesn't want to waste their last tradable first-round pick on a player who won't actually move the needle. That's one part of it. Then you've got the player assets. What little they even have. After 20 to 25 games, a few more of those guys they just signed will finally be trade eligible. That means names like Marcus Smart, DeAndre Ayton, Jalen Hood-Schifino, guys like Davion Mitchell, even players they brought back like Jackson Hayes, or the new draft pick Dalton Connect. That's the group that becomes trade eligible. That happens between December 15th and January 15th. So if 1, 2, 3, or even all of them flop, they suddenly shift from being part of the future to being nothing more than trade chips. Compare that to the players who are already trade eligible right now. Guys like Gabe Vincent, Maxi Kleber, and a few others, plus the always guarded draft picks. That's really the second part of this whole optionality spin. It's not just about if or when they want to trade, but about waiting until more of their pieces actually hit the eligibility window. By then, they'll know which guys are helping and which ones are dead weight. And notice how that December 15th to January 1st window lines up almost perfectly with their last mid-season move. That was the Dorian Finney-Smith deal, which also landed right in that sweet spot of the schedule. That all falls around the 25th to 30th game mark. Now, whether they actually repeat that kind of move this year is anyone's guess. Sure, we'll hear the trade rumors flying before then, but when it comes to pulling the trigger on a real deal, especially a big one, it feels like Pelinka is hinting it won't happen until at least 25 games in. And honestly, it's not just about judging performance or stats. It's also about health and durability. That's another huge factor tied to this 20 to 25 game window. A lot of their new additions come with health red flags. Marcus Smart has missed big chunks of time. DeAndre Ayton has been unreliable. Jake LaRavia has barely cracked the floor in his short career. Last season alone, Smart played just 34 games. Ayton only managed 40, and LaRavia hit 66, but had never even touched 35 games in a season before that. And that's before you even get to the guys the Lakers decided to keep. Jared Vanderbilt only suited up for 36 games last season. Maxi Kleber barely hit 34. If any of them still can't stay on the court or prove they're durable, they basically turn into trade bait. And honestly, Kleber is the prime example. He's on an expiring deal, and in the NBA, that kind of short-term contract becomes a disposable asset the moment the player stops producing. Same goes for Marcus Smart or DeAndre Ayton. If they're not healthy, or if they flop when they are healthy, then they're nothing more than trade chips. So it's not just about judging performance after the 20 to 25 game mark. It's also about testing their durability. If these guys can't stay on the floor and can't contribute when they do play, the Lakers will have no problem flipping them. Between that 25-game checkpoint, right around Christmas into New Year's, and the trade deadline a month later, you can bet this front office will be judging everyone as much by their health as their numbers. From the health and durability angle, to performance, to the money side of things, the Lakers are going to be weighing everything. They'll have to decide if it makes more sense to hold onto a contract and keep that player past the deadline, or flip him once the 25-game mark hits. That's really the third or fourth layer here, evaluating guys from every angle: performance, trade value, health, and durability. All of that gets bundled into this optionality buzzword Rob Pelinka keeps throwing out. But it's not just about their own roster. The other, and maybe biggest, part of this so-called optionality is the outside trade market. That means players who might not have a future with their current team. One name that's already floated again is Walker Kessler. If he doesn't land a contract extension with Utah, and the Jazz finally drop their ridiculous asking price, the Lakers could easily circle back and dangle assets for him. Will they? Maybe. But that's the kind of gamble Pelinka clearly has in mind when he keeps hyping this word. Again, none of this is guaranteed, but that's all wrapped into the so-called optionality. Beyond that, there's also the expiring contract route. Someone like Matisse Thybulle, for example, a guy who could actually fix one of their biggest weaknesses, a two-way 3 and D wing. If Jake LaRavia can't handle that role and proves it by the 25-game mark, then an expiring deal like Thibault's suddenly looks like a safer and more realistic option. And that's the thing. Expirings usually get cheaper as the deadline gets closer. But there's also the chaos factor. Teams that collapse around the deadline or stumble after 25 games. Look at the Miami Heat. If they're stuck in the play-in with a losing record, and if injuries pile up, maybe even Tyler Herro still being out, they might decide to blow it up. And that's when names like Andrew Wiggins could really hit the market. We've already heard the whispers about him being available, but right now it's still a crapshoot. Maybe he is, but not at anything close to a good price right now. If his team falls out of playoff contention, if they finally quit and blow it all up, then he'll almost definitely be available for much cheaper. So when you look at the bigger picture, teams sliding downhill and looking to sell, other players becoming more available at a discount, plus the expiring deals and guys without extensions, that's really the final piece of this optionality Pelinka keeps preaching about. So if you're lost on what he actually meant when he kept saying it over and over in that interview, this basically explains it. It's about when they'll actually pull the trigger on a trade, or at least start seriously thinking about it. Between evaluating their own roster's performance, judging health and durability, looking at short-term contracts, and scanning the outside trade market for bargains. That's the picture he's painting. And honestly, it's probably the clearest and most realistic read on what the Lakers are really planning. That's really all we've got to go off of right now. So with that in mind, what do you all think about Rob Pelinka's comments? Do you actually buy into this whole optionality thing he kept repeating? Do you think waiting 20 to 25 games before even thinking about a trade is smart? Or is it just another way of stalling? Maybe it's too long. Maybe it's the right amount of time. Or maybe it's way too short for a team with this many questions. Let me know what you think in the comments. That pretty much wraps this one up. And if you enjoyed it, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and turned on the notification bell so you don't miss future uploads. Thanks again for watching, and as always, hope you have a great day or night.